Hey everyone, I wanted to review an article about The Biggest Loser. This is an article from the New York Times in 2016. It's 3 years old now, written by Gina Colada. She's a she's been writing about health and weight loss now for quite a while. So this is a picture of Danny Cahill that you see up front here playing the guitar. I think that's him now because he lost. Let me see here. What was it? 239 pounds in 7 months. No. That's 239 pounds in 7 months when the show ended in December of 2009. I don't remember watching the show, but 239 pounds is pretty impressive, way more than I'm comfortable with. But I'll get to that in just a moment. I think there's a photo of him here. There he is. So that's when he started the show there, and then that's when he ended the show. Apparently, he's regained most of the weight, like a lot of people do. So yeah, let's see. So now he's 295 pounds, burns 800 fewer calories a day. I'm going to talk about the metabolic effects of that kind of weight loss, if any at all. But that's what this article is about. It's saying that when these people lost all this weight, their bodies kind of rebelled and it fought to get them back to their previous weight. That's what you call the set point theory. So your brain sets this set point and it doesn't, and if you go below that, it'll do everything in its power to return to that. So I wanted to focus on this graph here. Let me see if you can make sure you see it. Biggest losers fight a slower metabolism. So this black line up here is the baseline. That's where they started. And then this right here is at the end of the show. And then this line over here is where they are 6 years later. So the second chart here is kind of the crux of the whole thing, a slowing metabolism. And what it shows is your starting metabolism here on the left, and then this is starting, and then at the end of the show, this is what it is. But that's what you would expect if you lost that amount of weight. One thing I should show is that there's tremendous amounts of individual variation here. So some people, their metabolic rates went down a little bit. Look at Rudy. His metabolic rate went all the way down here in just 7 months. That's a lot, okay? So he was 800. But one thing that I need to make clear here is that this number over here is what's expected. So what it means is this 800 is fewer calories a day than is expected for a man of his size. So they use these formulas to predict what somebody's resting metabolic rate should be. That's the whole crux of this obesity article, and that's the crux of this New York Times article. I'm going to show why that's not really valid. Because if that formula isn't correct, then this whole study is invalid. I treat the whole Biggest Loser like a bad science experiment. You would never be able to do this for science, by the way. You can do it for entertainment, but you can't do it for science, which is kind of crazy. There's not an institutional review board in the world that would approve something like this. I read what they were doing. They were exercising 6 or 7 hours a day. They were only eating broccoli and grilled chicken breasts. They had to produce a 3,500 calorie deficit a day. I don't even burn 3,500 calories a day. They were insane. And they did this over 7 months. It was almost abuse. I can't believe they got away with doing it, but they did. The takeaway that the researchers and the doctors that they quote in this article is that if you lose a ton of weight, then your body will slow down its resting metabolic rate to make it easier to regain the weight. That's the argument that they're making. I'm going to quote this one part. It says, most people who have tried to lose weight know how hard it is to keep the weight off, but many blame themselves. What obesity research has consistently shown is that dieters are at the mercy of their own bodies, which muster hormones and an altered metabolic rate to pull them back to their old weights. So again, that's the argument that they're making, that their body will deliberately slow down its metabolic rate to keep them obese in a way. If it doesn't sound like that makes sense, it doesn't. And I'll show you why. This is a picture of Dina Mercado. She says, it's hard. The cravings are there. I think that's really interesting that she still has these cravings. A lot of people who lose weight or they break bad eating habits, they still have those cravings for months, even years. And apparently she still has those cravings. My advice for Dina would be you can't get rid of the cravings, but you can manage them. Like you can do something about it. A craving is not destiny. Just because you have a craving for something doesn't mean that you have to satisfy that craving. There are other things you can do about those cravings. They can't make you do anything. It's just an uncomfortable thought that you have in your head. Then they quote David Ludwig, who gets a lot of publicity when it comes to weight loss and obesity. He said the study was limited by its small size, 14, and the lack of control group of obese people. But he said the findings make sense. If they don't show a return to normal in metabolism, what hope is there for the rest? He says it means we need to explore other options. Then they quote Miss Egbert. So she's the one who she's the only contestant who weighs less than she did at the end of the show, out of the 14 that they examined. She says what people don't understand is that a treat is like a drug. 2 treats can turn into a binge over a 3-day period. That is what I struggle with. So what I'm seeing here is that she never really dealt with her brain. So she lost all that weight. She did the exercise. She did the work, but she never did any work on her brain. So she's in a new body with the same old brain that she had before. That's why it's such a struggle. And then they talk about Sean Algier. I'm not sure, a pastor from Charlotte. He went from 444 to 289 during the show. Now his weight is to 450. That really sucks to go down all the way to 289 and then to rebound higher than where you were before. And if you look at that chart above, you'll notice that 4 of the contestants actually weigh more than they did before they started the show. They're actually worse off now. 4 out of these 14. He says it's kind of like hearing you have a life sentence. But here's the thing, he doesn't have a life sentence. This is the point I want to make. He didn't have to go from 444 to 289 to 450. I argue that if he had started at 444 and just focused on 443 and then 442, and he had lost 1 or 2 pounds a week over the course of 1 or 2 years, he would have been way better off. I don't support rapid weight loss. It's usually not a good idea. Most people can't sustain it. Keep in mind that this show was an artificial environment. The people were placed on this compound. I forget where they filmed it, but they had exercise physiologists. They had a personal trainer, Jillian Michaels, screaming at them the entire time. They had nutritionists. They had physicians. They had all this social support. They couldn't leave. Their diets were restricted. This is not real life. This is not how people deal with cravings in the real world. This is not how people lose weight in the real world. This is why we can only draw so many conclusions from this article or this study, because it's not a good study. It was artificially done. It was an artificial environment. If this were a scientific study, I would ask myself, can we apply these results to the real world? That's what you call external validity. Are these results applicable to other people? And the answer is no. That's why I think people are looking I made a video about one of my patients who's 550 pounds. My advice to him, focus on 549, then 548, then 547. People can usually lose 1 pound. Just focus on that one step. He doesn't have to lose 8 pounds a week. I think that's part of the problem too with these people, is that they lost such a tremendous amount of weight. And I'm not saying that rapid weight loss can alter your metabolism in a way. I've lost 3 or 4 pounds a week over the course of four months. So it wasn't 8 pounds, but it was a lot faster than what I should have done. And it didn't affect my metabolism at all. Your metabolism is actually really resilient. And what other research has shown too is that when people lose a lot of weight, the resting metabolic rates decline, which is what you would expect in weight loss because you're moving less mass. Like it takes less energy to move a smaller body, duh. But what happens is when they start refeeding, that resting metabolic rate goes up. And now the truth comes out. So slower metabolisms were not the only reason the contestants regained weight, though. They constantly battled hunger, cravings, and binges. I wonder, it's in the past tense. It said battled. And I think that means until now, or are they still battling hunger, cravings, and binges? I imagine they still are. And it says the reason why is because of plummeting levels of leptin. So leptin is a hormone that's secreted by the fat tissue. It sends a signal to the brain, and it tells the brain, we don't need more food. Like it makes you less hungry when you have leptin. Whereas if you have higher levels of ghrelin, which is another hormone, I forget what secretes it, it makes you hungrier. And so what they're saying is that they have decreased levels of, I'm pretty sure they have the hunger, cravings, and the binges, which like I said before, they have the same brain in a different body. And I don't think we have to blame a slower metabolism to explain why they're having so much trouble maintaining their weight. It's because they have the hunger and the cravings and the binges, and they never learn to deal with that. They certainly didn't learn to deal with that on The Biggest Loser. They were in this controlled environment where they couldn't eat ad libitum or as much as they wanted. They didn't have access to the food that they have access to in the real world. And the worst thing to do is to put these people in this chamber, restrict what they eat, do no work on their brain, and then just let them loose in the real world. I'm not surprised at all that they regain the weight. And I don't think we can blame it on the slower metabolism. Then here's a picture of the pastor. So Sean, I can't pronounce his name, Algier. I'm not sure, but that's him before, and then that's him after the show. And now he's basically this again. And what the article is claiming is that his metabolism is slower than what it was before. I question that because, and I'll show you the data that gives me reason to believe that's not true. It says it's not as dramatic as being told you have a disease, but it's along those lines. And this is what modern obesity research teaches. It teaches that obesity is a disease and that there's nothing you can do about it. I completely disagree. I don't think, and the reason I disagree is because they just said it above. They just said they're dealing with the cravings, the hunger, and the binges. That to me doesn't sound like a disease. To me, it sounds like they're making bad choices in the moment. And in that moment, when they have that craving to consume a bunch of fat and sugar, they're making that choice to consume it instead of saying, no, I'm going to tolerate a little bit of discomfort right now because I know that's what the healthy option is. And I know that's easier said than done. I've dealt with it before. Rejecting a craving isn't always the most pleasant experience, but you still have control over it. And as long as you have control over it, it's not a disease. It's not like cancer. You can't use willpower or you can't use thought to overcome cancer. Cancer just kind of does its thing. Obesity is not the same way. And I'm sorry that obesity research has reached that point and is telling people like Sean and Dina that they have some sort of disease. They don't have a disease. And then they quote this guy named Dr. Proieto. I hope I'm saying that right. The body puts multiple mechanisms in place to get you back to your weight. No, it doesn't. It's not the body, it's the brain. The only way to maintain weight loss is to be hungry all the time. That's not true either. I've lost 30, 40 pounds, whatever, and I'm no hungrier than I was than when I was a binge eater. In fact, I was hungrier when I was a binge eater than what I am now. I think that's why it's hard to break binge eating sometimes, is because it just reinforces itself. It's like one binge leads to another, which leads to another, and the cravings get more and more intense. But when you remove the behavior, it's like I actually got less hungry when I stopped binging. So that's not true for me, and I know I'm only one person, but my advice for people like this would be lose weight at a sustainable weight, decrease the reward value of what you're eating. So instead of eating cakes and pies and cookies and ice cream, eat more stuff like potatoes and protein and yogurt, nuts, stuff that actually fills you up and makes you feel more satisfied. Be more aware of what you're eating. Be more conscious of what you're eating. Cut the hedonic eating. When I'm talking about hedonic eating, that's just like pleasure eating. You're eating for entertainment. You're eating for some kind of emotion. You're eating for all the wrong reasons. If you're trying to maintain that level of weight loss and you find it hard, just really analyze your hunger. Analyze your hunger after each bite if you have to. But you shouldn't have to go hungry all the time to maintain your weight loss. That's bad advice. Now back to Mr. Cahill. He says his weight problem began when he was in 3rd grade. He got fat, then fatter. He would starve himself and then eat a whole can of frosting with a spoon. Then he would cower in the pantry off the kitchen, feeling overwhelmed with shame. So what it sounds like to me is he's predisposed to gain weight, which some people are. That's just luck of the draw. Can't explain that. It's just genetics. But he also has a history of eating disorders and dieting. Dieting, I think, is the key factor here. I can guarantee you that every contestant on this show dieted at some point. I promise you. Dieting is a massive risk factor for obesity and for weight gain. It happens every time. You starve yourself, you trigger survival mechanisms, and then you regain all that weight. And so what it looks like here is starving, binging, starving, binging, starving, binging. That's what he started at. That was his habit. And then they put him in this artificial environment for 7 months, whatever it was. He lost the 239 pounds. But when he left, he still had the same habits. He still had the same brain. And when he had access to all of the food that we have available in grocery stores and restaurants, convenience stores, where it's cheap and easy to get to, his weight came back because he hadn't taken care of the brain. You don't have to come up with some complex theory about the metabolism to explain his weight gain. Okay, now they talk about the way they lost the weight. Get this. Sequestered on the Biggest Loser ranch with other contestants, Mr. Cahill exercised 7 hours a day, burning 8 to 9,000 calories, according to a calorie tracker. He set a goal of a 3,500 caloric deficit per day. The goal was to lose 8 pounds a day. That's insane. He quit his job as a land surveyor to do it. His routine was like this: wake up at 5, run on the treadmill, have breakfast, which was 1 egg, half a grapefruit, and a piece of grain toast, run on the treadmill for another 45 minutes, rest 40 minutes, bike 9 miles to the gym, work out 2.5 hours, ride home, have chicken breast and broccoli, rest for an hour, drive to the gym for another round of exercise. All right, you tell me, how many people in the real world have the time or the willpower to do that? I don't have the time or the willpower to do that. Unless I'm training for a triathlon and I have a chance to win it, I'm not working out like that. As much as I like endurance activities, I also have a life. And this is why this whole Biggest Loser thing is just a really bad science experiment. And I'm surprised that scientists are trying to draw conclusions from it, because it's a bad science experiment. If he had not burned enough calories to hit his goal, he went back to the gym to work out some more. He found himself running around his neighborhood in the dark until his calorie burn indicator reset to 0 at midnight. Yeah, what a life. So no wonder he lost that weight. And it wasn't even necessary. He didn't have to do it like that. If he had given himself 1 or 2 years to lose the weight, let's say a pound a week for 2 years, he would have lost 100 and he wouldn't be in this situation right now. So think about it. He did all that work, all that stress for nothing, basically. Here's a picture of one of the more successful contestants, let's say Amanda Arluscas in Raleigh, North Carolina. She says, I could tell something wasn't right with my body. I just knew it was an issue with my metabolism. How did she know it was an issue with her metabolism? I don't think it was an issue at all. I think the problem was she had lost weight in that artificial environment without doing any work up here. And now she's stuck with a bad brain and a slimmer body. The article continues this whole thing about metabolism. He says, Mr. Cahill's slow metabolism is part of the problem, and so are his food cravings. No, I would argue that his food cravings are like 90% of the problem, not his metabolism. He opens a bag of chips thinking he will have just a few. I'd eat 5 bites, then I'd black out, eat the whole bag of chips, and say, what did I do? So why are they blaming metabolism? When the answer is obviously the binging. He's binging to get fat. It's not the metabolism at all. They quote Michael Rosenbaum, an obesity researcher at Columbia University. He says, we consume about 1 million calories a year. Those small differences between intake and output average only to about 10 to 20 calories per day. Less than one Starburst candy, but the cumulative consequences over time can be devastating. Yes, 10 or 20 calories a day on paper, that makes sense, but that's not what's happening in real life. They're consuming entire bags of potato chips. They're binging on cookies. It's not 20 calories at a time. That's not how people gain weight. They don't gain weight 10 or 20 calories at a time. They gain weight in spurts, right? That's how I gained it. I mean, I gained like 10 kilos in about 4 or 5 months. It wasn't this nice 10 or 20 calorie increase every day. I wish people would stop using that line of logic. Rosenbaum says the difficulty in keeping weight off reflects biology, not a pathological lack of willpower. Well, I would say it's neither. It's not biology or willpower. It's what decisions are you making? It's how are you dealing with those cravings? They don't have to live with hunger forever. It doesn't take a lot of food to satisfy hunger. I fasted for several days in a row, and I remember having 1 sweet potato, and I felt satisfied. I felt energized. It doesn't take much to satisfy it. And these people are not that much different from me. They have the same type of brain, same body, same metabolic pathways, same organs. They're not that much different. And this is Tracy Yukich, also from Raleigh. So she was at 250, got down to 132. Now she's at 178, which is pretty respectable. She says, I eat very clean and stay away from sugar, and I take supplements. Okay, so how is it that she can maintain a pretty good amount of weight loss, but these other people can't? Okay, is her metabolism less damaged than the other people? I'm not buying into this whole metabolic explanation for things. That's the end of the article. Let me go to, this is the article that I was talking about. And the lead researcher here, I think, was Kevin Hall. Even though he appears last, I've seen him quoted a lot more, so I'm going to quote him. Here's the graph here. So baseline, end of competition at 30 weeks, and follow-up at 6 years. And so let's look at here. So one thing I wanted to show here, this is fat mass in kilograms, and this is free fat mass, or fat-free mass, excuse me. So fat mass at the beginning was 73.4 kilograms. I think that's a mean of the 14 contestants. At the end, it was 26.2. What were they losing? They were losing a lot of fat. And I hear this myth perpetuated over and over, that when you lose a lot of weight, you just lose your muscle. Well, the thing is, that doesn't make sense because muscle is really hard to break down. Metabolically, it's hard to break down. Whereas body fat, converting body fat into energy is much easier for the body to do. It's designed to be that way. You store that fat for the rainy day, and then when you're in a caloric deficit, it's right there. You can burn it, and you have energy to survive. So they lost a lot of that. In fact, I think later in the article it says that 80% of their weight loss was fat, and they lost a little bit of muscle. So if you're losing weight, don't worry about losing all your muscle. You can mitigate that too with slightly higher intake of protein and resistance training, but topic for another discussion. Okay, here we go. So RMR measured was 1996, so just under 2000, and then 1903 after 6 years. So here's my point. Resting metabolic rate is not severely low in these people. 1900 calories a day, that's resting metabolic rate. So if they just stayed in bed and did nothing, they would still be burning 1900 calories a day. That's well above what mine is. I used the calculator that they use to predict their resting metabolic rates. I forget what it's called. It's 2 words, but I typed in my weight, my height, my age, activity level, all that, and it came out to about 1450 to 1500 calories. So they're burning way more than what I am. Their RMR predicted, this is the big problem with this whole research article, is because they're using a standard equation. The problem is they only have 14 contestants, and they're using contestants that were significantly overweight, who had BMIs over 40. And they're assuming that that equation can somehow predict their RMR accurately. It might work for normal weight people like me. I don't think it works for really obese people. And what other research has shown too is that when people are really big, they actually have what's called a metabolic advantage. And what that is when people reach a certain weight and there's just nowhere else to put the fat, their bodies start burning more calories. So the resting metabolic rate actually increases. And I don't think they took that into account. And so that explains why their RMRs, like the reduction in RMR was greater than what they had predicted, because when they used the predicted RMR, they thought it was going to be this high when in fact it was really this high, and so the gap is actually bigger. Now that they're at normal weight, they don't have that metabolic advantage anymore. I think that explains why there's such a huge gap here, because look at the RMR that's actually measured. 1903, 1996, that's still a pretty good RMR. They're not starving, and if they start doing anything, they start doing exercise, then they're up to like 2600 calories a day. They can still eat a good amount of food and not regain the weight. And so this metabolic adaptation here is RMR predicted minus this RMR measured. So they just take 2272 minus 1996 and they come out to 275. And they're saying that this difference, this metabolic adaptation, so let's say 499 or 500 calories, that's explaining this rapid regain. I explained that there's something else going on here, like binging. And so I don't know why they resort to these really complex theories when the real answer is staring us in the face. They have these new bodies, but old habits. And so those old habits are bringing them back to their old bodies. You don't have to have some complex theory about metabolism. And then look at down here, TEE, that's total energy expenditure. At the end of look at this, at the end of the 30 weeks, it was 3,002, so about 3,000 a day, plus or minus 573. At 6 months, it was 3,429. So if it's a bad metabolism, why are they burning more now than they were when the show ended? That doesn't make sense to me. In fact, it tells me that that their metabolisms are actually working, because as they regain that weight over time, their resting metabolic rates went up, and that's what all the previous research shows, that when people lose weight, their RMRs go down. When they regain the weight, their RMRs go up. That's exactly what we predict. And if you think about it from a scientific point of view, it doesn't really make sense to store all this fat, burn it all, and then lower your metabolic rate. Why would your body want to go back to that obese state? There's no advantage to being obese if you think about it. Having a little bit of extra body fat makes sense, because then you can survive when you don't have a lot of food. But the heavier you get, the harder it is to move. Here's some of the discussion they have. After 6 years, most subjects regained a significant amount of weight, but there was a wide degree of individual variation. And I think this metabolic theory needs to take that into account. Why is there individual variation? And I think the individual variation can be accounted by differences in decisions. Some people were very committed to keeping that weight off. Some people were more diligent. Some people didn't succumb to the binges, whereas others, like Danny Cahill and that pastor, they never learned to deal with the cravings. TEE and physical activity, after 6 years, TEE increased. So they're actually burning more after 6 years, which to me doesn't indicate a faulty metabolism, but remain below baseline because they weigh less, while physical activity was not significantly changed since the end of the competition. Does that mean they're doing 7-hour workouts these days? I don't know how to. So let's look at blood glucose. At the beginning it was 96, which is pretty healthy. Anything below 100 I think is pretty good. End of competition at 30 weeks was 70, which is really low. Follow-up was 105. So their blood glucose is pretty much the same, although their blood sugar now is a little higher than it should be. I think anything below 100 is where they should be. Let's see, LDL is actually down since it was at the end of the competition, which is a good thing. HDL is more or less the same. So it doesn't look like they're any less healthy from a metabolic standpoint. Then they measured leptin, which is interesting. So they had 41 nanograms per milliliter at the beginning. Now they're at about 28. So that could explain why they're eating more, because they have lower levels of leptin. And so when you have lower levels of leptin, it's harder to satiate hunger. I think that's a lot more plausible than blaming the decrease in their RMR. Look at the end; it was 2.56. So they basically had no leptin at the end of the competition. Then they get into RMR and metabolic adaptation here. RMR at baseline was 2,600, which is really high, even for an obese person, but that's what they measured. And then it fell to 2,000, which is what you would expect. So I have a 10 calorie per pound rule. If you lose 100 pounds, you're probably going to burn 1,000 calories fewer at the end of that 100 pounds, because it takes fewer calories to move less mass, right? So if you're going to lose 30 pounds, expect to burn 300 calories fewer. That's just my rule. It's not true for everybody, but it's a good rule of thumb. RMR was decreased by 610 calories at the end of the competition. I don't know why that's so spectacular. That's what you would predict. If you lost 60 pounds, which is what some of these people did, and you multiply that by 10, that's 600 calories. Then they get to the discussion here. They say that mean RMR after 6 years was 500 calories a day lower than expected, based on measured body composition changes. So again, they're using this formula to predict what RMR should be for their size. What I'm saying is that's faulty, because they're using a formula for really obese patients, and they had that obesity advantage, meaning they were burning more than what would be expected because they were obese, and the change in metabolic rate would be greater than what we would expect because they had that advantage. I don't think they're taking that into account. Then they say it again. The Biggest Loser participants with the greatest weight loss at the end of the competition also experienced the greatest slowing of RMR, which is what we'd expect, right? Because they lost the most weight. But those who were most successful in maintaining their weight loss at 6 years also experienced greater ongoing metabolic slowing. And again, that's a contradiction of this whole article. because they're trying to blame the weight regain on the metabolic adaptation, even though the people who are successful at maintaining their weight loss are also the ones who had the greatest metabolic slowing. Later, they say that previous cross-sectional studies found that subjects who had lost weight exhibited a 3 to 5% lower RMR compared with control subjects who had not lost weight, which is not that significant. I mean, 3 to 5%. I mean, are we going to blame a 3 to 5% lower RMR on gaining 100 pounds? That just doesn't make sense. When all subjects were considered together, no significant metabolic adaptation was found after the 6-month weight regain period, and there was no significant association between weight regain and metabolic adaptation. So again, why are we blaming metabolic adaptation? Longer-term studies in women have found no significant sustained reductions in RMR. In the classic Minnesota starvation experiment, where they took normal men, they starved them. They didn't really starve them. I think they were still eating 16 or 1700 calories a day. The suppression of RMR rapidly reversed, which is exactly what we would expect. A recent study demonstrated an elevated RMR during a period of enforced overfeeding after a period of underfeeding. Rapid weight loss is sometimes claimed to increase the risk of weight regain, but recent studies have failed to support this idea, which is surprising to me. I used to think that really rapid weight loss would actually predict weight regain in the future, but I can't argue with the science. I still don't recommend it for various reasons. Most people can't sustain it, and it's not necessary. It's not like you're gonna die unless you lose 50 pounds in 2 months. Most people don't need to do that. Most people need to think long term, and that's usually the best way to do it. The magnitude of early weight loss is the best predictor of long-term weight loss. Again, that's counterintuitive. I wouldn't have thought so. And then they say, of course, the extreme and public nature of this weight loss intervention makes it difficult to translate our results to more typical weight loss programs. You don't say. And that's the end of the article. All right, so what can we glean from this really bad science experiment, if you want to call it a science experiment? First of all, rapid weight loss is usually not a good idea for most people, unless you're going to live in a controlled environment for an extended period of time. But of course, what happens when you get back to the real world and you have to make real choices and you're exposed to various temptations? We basically live in a giant cafeteria. If you go to a cafeteria, there's a bunch of high-calorie, palatable food that you have access to. Nobody's stopping you. Food is cheaper than ever. It's more convenient than ever. It's tastier than ever. It's less satisfying than it used to be. So you take these people who are predisposed to weight gain, who have never exercised in their lives, who have just undergone a 30-week boot camp, basically, and then you put them in the real world. What do you expect is going to happen? You don't need to blame the metabolism on this. We saw it in the article, and the article talks about it, but it acts like it's not really a factor. They say their bodies fought back. No, their bodies didn't fight back. They just never took care of those habits. The only way to create new habits is to expose yourself to choices. You have to give yourself the opportunity to make a bad choice. If you give yourself the opportunity to make a bad choice and then you make the good choice, that's when you start to see real results. You can't put yourself on an island and then come back to reality and expect to make better and healthier decisions than you were making before. I don't think the real work was done at The Biggest Loser. I think they did a lot of physical work, obviously, and they did a lot of starving, and so they got temporary results, but they didn't fix this. They didn't fix the habits that were in their head. They talk about these people like Cahill who says that he's eating a whole bag of chips, and then there's that, what's her name, Miss Egbert, who says that treats her like a drug. That tells me it's the brain. It's not really the metabolism. So when you lose weight, don't worry about ruining your metabolism. It's really, really hard to screw up your metabolic rate, especially in the long term. If you look at that Minnesota experiment that they did with those young men in the basement, who was the researcher on that? Ansel Keys or whatever. Their RMRs went down, but once they started refeeding themselves, and their RMRs came back. And that's what every other experiment has shown, that you can temporarily suppress RMR, but it comes back. Because that's what the body wants to do. That's The body always wants to be at homeostasis. You get cold, you put on a blanket. You get hot, you wear a t-shirt and shorts, or you turn on the fan, okay? Those are just homeostatic mechanisms that we have in place. And this article in Obesity, which is published by the Obesity Society, they even cite some of the research. It's saying, listen, previous research has shown that RMR will come back, that there's no metabolic adaptation in these other studies. So why are they blaming metabolic adaptation for these people? Are these people so different? I mean, what is the difference here? And when you look at the data and it says their RMRs are 600 calories less than would be expected, but you don't find that in other studies, you have to question why. And I think the reason why is because they're using a faulty formula to predict it. I showed you that data. Their RMRs right now are 2,000 calories a day, and their TEE is about 3,000 calories a day. These people aren't starving. They can still eat a good amount of food and not regain the weight. Something else has to be explaining the weight regain. And what I'm saying is, it's these cravings and these urges that they have to overeat and to binge consistently. That's how they're gaining the weight. They're not regaining the weight because they're burning 300 or 400 calories fewer a day. Some people, I don't know if you noticed, but the metabolic adaptation was very little. Their metabolic rates were basically the same as it was at the end of the 30 weeks. So why did they regain the weight? Why did one person need bariatric surgery a few years after the end of the competition? The other thing too is that the people who sustained the most weight loss had the most metabolic adaptation. So again, that's not what the hypothesis would predict. Something else has to explain why some people were able to maintain the weight loss and others weren't. The other thing too, 80% of the weight loss was fat mass. So don't worry about losing a lot of muscle. You can blunt that, like I said, with protein and resistance training. They also remained pretty healthy. HDL was high, LDL was lower. The other thing too is if you look at baseline characteristics of other studies that have looked at this, you look at other studies where the subjects have similar characteristics at the beginning of the study as the Biggest Loser contestants had at the end of the competition, you notice that their RMRs are about the same. My point is, the RMR at the end of the Biggest Loser was where we should expect it to be. It's similar to subjects in other studies. So I think that's another strike against this metabolic adaptation. My best advice for these people is focus on the brain. Don't worry about the metabolism. You can't really affect the metabolism. Like I said, even yo-yo dieting for many years, it's really hard to screw it up. Your body kind of likes to have the same metabolic rate. I binge purged, starved myself, tried various diets, and my metabolism now is as good as it's ever been. I don't have to worry about that. The other thing is maintaining weight is sometimes harder than losing it in the first place. So yes, you need to be vigilant. Yes, you should probably weigh yourself on a consistent basis. Take body measurements with the tape measure. You need to be more conscious about how you're eating as well as what you're eating. You need to eat for physiological reasons and less for emotional reasons. Cut the binging, cut the distracted eating. Don't eat when you're doing something else. Cut the emotional eating. If you do that, you don't have to be hungry all the time, but you really do need to be eating when you're genuinely hungry, and just let the chips fall where they may. Don't force anything. Eat for hunger. Eat foods that are very satisfying. Lower the reward value of what you're eating, and you'll be fine. I hope you found this article review useful. I'll do more articles in the future, and I will see you next time. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Some of you probably won't agree with my interpretations of this data, but if you disagree with me, that's fine. Just tell me why. So I look forward to the discussion. See you next time.